My talk begins the 50th anniversary conference theme, Aging Past, Present and Future, by looking back to the early 17th century, a past that is nevertheless known as the early modern period, one of innovation and change. The conference logo of Lancaster Castle graphically suggests the value of reviewing the past from our present perspectives, but this is a two-way process. I hope that by giving you a glimpse into how ageing was viewed in early modern culture, I can show you how that past might, in turn, inform our present views of ageing and suggest directions for the future. In addition, my talk acts as a virtual welcome to Lancaster by focusing on how age, anxiety and persecution feature in the case of the Lancashire Witches, a story that put Lancaster on the national map in 1612 and remains a centrepiece of Lancashire tourism, as you can see from these images. Like the location, the witches too have been glamorised, most dramatically in this Morehouse's brewery advert for Pendle Witches Brew. The first part of my talk will briefly outline the history of the Lancashire Witches as a prelude to analysing why ageing women were a focus for anxiety and accusations of witchcraft. In stark contrast to the seductive witch in the beer advert, Thomas Potts's account of the 1612 witch trial, The Wonderful Discovery of Witches in the County of Lancaster, described Anne Whittle, the first woman to be examined, as about the age of 80 years, 80 or thereabouts, and, quote, a very old, withered, spent and decrepit creature, her sight almost gone. Potts's very full record of the trial, which was written to justify the court proceedings to a national audience, ironically reveals the deep anxieties and prejudices that led to the accusations and the executions of the victims. The decrepit Anne Whittle was defined as a dangerous witch of very long continuance, whose enmity with another 80-year-old neighbour, Elizabeth Southerns, and Elizabeth's enmity with her, produced an outbreak of devilish practices, consultations, meetings, and murders committed by them. Potts allies the ages of Anne Whittle and Elizabeth Southerns with their demonic practices by referring to them with their aliases or witch names as Old Chattocks or Old Demdike. Elizabeth, or Old Demdike, who had actually died in Lancaster Castle before the trial began, is described as, quote, a very old woman, about the age of 80 years, who dwelt in the forest of Pendle, a vast place, very fit for her profession. It's perhaps because her aged person was absent, even though her testimonies were used in the trial, that Potts can freely describe this 80-year-old as a wicked firebrand of mischief, as he says here, and a powerful agent for the devil. Indeed, she and Anne Whittle became, by virtue of their status as widows and as grandmothers, demonic matriarchs, perverting their domestic roles to propagate witchcraft. Potts says that Elizabeth, quote, brought up her own children, instructed her grandchildren, and took great care and pains to bring them to be witches. According to Potts, from these two, the grandmothers, sprung all the rest in order, and were the children and friends of those notorious witches. I'm quoting here from the modern edition of The Wonderful Discovery of Witches, with the text modernised by Robert Poole, which is very good if you want to read the whole of Potts's text. It makes it very much easier. I've taken the imaginary portraits on those last two slides by this sympathetic cover illustration by Pat Southern. This image from Potts's text, along with his own narrative and the testimonies of the accused, tells stories of demonic familiars, conjuring food, muttering charms, and sticking pins into dolls to cause injuries to animals and people. Pacts with the devil and coven meetings, practices which were much more commonly associated with the mass witch trials in Europe. These stories, which escalated the story of the two old women, that story of enmity between the two old women, to involve a trial of 20 people in Lancashire in 1612, 10 women and 2 men in Lancaster and 1 woman in York, and later 6 women and 2 men from Salisbury. Nothing like this had happened before in Britain. As Potts explained, upon the carriage of this business, the eyes of all parts of Lancashire and the other counties in the north parts thereunto adjoining were bent, and so an infinite a multitude came to the arraignment and trial of these witches at Lancaster, the number of them being known to exceed all others at any time heretofore, at one time to be arraigned and receive their trial. The number of the Lancashire witches, and particularly their group meetings, allied them with the sensational large covens of supposed witches celebrating black Sabbaths or black masses together, leading to the mass witch hunts in Europe. The Pendle witches were accused of meeting all the most dangerous and wicked and damnable witches in the county, far and near, in a meeting at Malkin Tower in the Forest of Pendle, the home of old Demdike and her daughter Elizabeth, in order to plot the release of those already arrested, the grandmothers and Anne's daughter and Elizabeth's granddaughter. Potts dramatically reports the meeting. Upon Good Friday they met, according to a solemn appointment, solemnized this great festival day according to their former order, with great cheer, merry company, and much conference. In the end, in this great assembly, it was decreed Master Covell, by reason of his office, he was the gaoler in Lancaster Castle, shall be slain by the next assizes, the castle of Lancaster to be blown up, and the aid and assistance to be sent to kill Master Lister. The date of the meeting, Good Friday, the holiest day of the Christian calendar for church-going, fasting and repentance, seemed to confirm the subversive nature of the Malkin Tower alternative festival at which a stolen ram was eaten. Imagine the excitement in 2012 when a 17th century cottage was excavated in Lower Black Moss under the shadow of Pendle Hill, complete with a sealed room containing a mummified cat. Simon Entwistle told the BBC, "Here we have an incredibly rare find, right at the heart of witching country. This could well be the famous Malkin Tower, which has been a source of speculation and rumour for centuries." As a consequence of the interviews about Malkin Tower and its meeting in 1612, more were arrested as witches and brought to trial at Lancaster Castle. 8 women and 2 men, listed here, were judged and sentenced on 19th of August 1612 and hanged for witchcraft. The plaque on the right-hand side is from the Golden Lion pub on Moor Lane in Lancaster, where they reputedly were allowed to have a last drink on their way to the gallows. It offers a different retrospective judgment, remembering the 9th woman, Elizabeth Southerns, as Mother Demdike, who had died in prison, and all those who suffered through prejudice and intolerance. Why did the activities of 2 old women, Elizabeth Southerns and Anne Whittle, spiral into the first large-scale witch trial in Britain? Was it because of a much wider prejudice in early modern England against old people, and old women in particular? The literary critic Elizabeth Barry has argued that in modern society from the 19th to the 20th centuries, quote, "Aging is a taboo, old people are invisible, and this is because the signs of an aging body are the signs of a dying body, and thus a cause of anxiety." In the pre-modern world, by contrast, the relation between the body, soul, and supernatural forces made aging much more than a physical process. It was a transition rather than a decline. The early modern period, as its name suggests, stands between these two extremes. We can see an example of this in the postscript of a manuscript letter from William Burghley, Queen Elizabeth I's Prime Minister, to Sir Ralph Sadler, which was written on the 18th of January 1585. Burghley finishes the business part of his letter and then writes in his PS down here, God called your old acquaintance the Earl of Lincoln on Saturday last from us, who died Christianly and so gently as, speaking of God very devoutly and plainly, he forthwith fell into a little short breathing like a shudder, and with one puff bigger than the rest, died in a marvellous quiet sort, without any voice or stir. God, I hope, hath his soul. He said his age was 74, but I think he was more. He was actually 74. Sure I am that you are far beyond it. Sadler was 78, which God increase to his service. We have here one older a great deal, a lusty man in body and mind, plus a Mr. Cook who saith he is 98. That is 18, and I'm indebted to my brilliant senior colleague, Professor Meg Twycross, for her help in transcribing the Roman numerals there. Burghley's letter seems to straddle a combination of pre-modern and modern awareness of aging. Burghley reads the gentle death of the 74-year-old Lincoln, who you can see in the painting there. He was a former military commander, in pre-modern terms as a transition to godly salvation, and hopes that God has his soul. With a more modern consciousness, Burghley also notes the physical details: loss of breath, shuddering, loss of voice, and movement. The details of ages in the letter also show how early modern people at least could live for a long time, and old people were expected to continue in active service to the Queen. At 78 years old, Sir Ralph Sadler was still working full-time for Elizabeth I in a high-security job, keeping Mary Queen of Scots under house arrest, while Burghley, the writer, a sprightly 65, is still rising in his court position as Elizabeth's first minister, in which he died aged 78. Although Elizabeth Southerns and Anne Whittle were very old, at about 80, the idea of them as active agents of the devil is not as ridiculous as it might seem at first. Burghley, having made the point about the comparative ages of Lincoln and Sadler, quickly attempts to reassure the 78-year-old Sadler that Burghley says that he knows a man who is a great deal older and lusty in body and mind, and one Mr. Cook says that this man is a remarkable 98. So maybe Burghley's household was an early modern blue zone. The private letter thus gives a very positive view of active and healthy aging. Beyond a private letter, though, how are attitudes to age expressed publicly in early modern media? Do we find anything like the rather ageist attitudes identified by Patrick Marriott and Marina Ravelli in the 21st century Canadian and American newspapers that they analysed? They list three types of ageism: compassionate ageism, in which, quote, seniors were painted as victims who were mentally and physically incapable of taking care of themselves. Secondly, intergenerational ageism, in which older people are perceived as strong and greedy, part of an age war with the younger generation. And thirdly, new ageism, which projects overly positive ideas of and ideals of healthy or active aging, which are impossible for many people to reach. Marriott and Ravelli were disappointed to find, quote, very few articles portraying a more holistic or complex understanding of aging. By contrast, I would argue that some early modern print and drama, the nearest equivalent to television, does offer a more complex media picture of old age. Shakespeare's King Lear, for example, exposes each of these models of ageism to critical scrutiny. King Lear, nearly the oldest character in Shakespeare, is regarded by all, including himself, as a foolish, fond old man, 80 and upward, he says. But rather than simply reproduce compassionate ageism and think of him as hopeless, the play demonstrates how Lear's vulnerability and experience of age teaches him the invaluable lesson of compassion to all his subjects. Cordelia, his youngest daughter, is tragically killed as a result of her compassionate care, which restores respect and sanity to the aged Lear. But nevertheless, the play ends positively, or with a positive element, in Edgar's lines, "We that are young shall never see so much, nor live so long." This admiration for age and experience is a striking contrast to the intergenerational ageism of the other younger characters. This is symbolised under number 2 here by a line from Edmund: "The younger rises while the old doth fall." Edmund, however, is presented as a villain who betrays his father, while his brother Edgar, quoted above, rescues Gloucester from despair and attempted suicide, assuring him, "Thy life's a miracle." The play doesn't offer overly positive ideals of healthy or active aging, which are impossible for many people to reach, however. Gloucester's life is a miracle and to be treasured precisely because he is blind and extremely frail. He and Lear are both utterly dependent on others and die shortly after this. Shakespeare's plays are not new ageist. Even the very active Prospero in The Tempest resigns his magic and admits every third thought shall be my grave, suggesting that his activity is self-regulated by moral and material awareness. When we come to address ageing and gender, Michael Preeler's research on the more negative stereotypes of older women in contemporary media does seem to be borne out by stereotypes in many early modern examples. In Shakespeare's All's Well That Ends Well, for example, age is personified as a female witch or a hag that attacks masculinity. The aged king laments his lack of corporal soundness now and the loss of his friend, saying, "He lasted long, but on us both did haggish age steal on and wore us out of act." Does this negatively gendered view of age, found again with the Lancashire Witches, occur more widely? I can't offer you a survey like those in gerontology studies of today, but the published literature of the period, the stories in print, can offer a sense of what Raymond Williams has called the structure of feeling in a society. A database, Early English Books Online, of over 1 billion words from printed text, and a search tool called Corpus Query Processor, developed at Lancaster by my colleague Andrew Hardy, offer a rough way to survey attitudes to old men and old women. As you would expect from a strongly patriarchal society, uses of the word man, which is used for human as well, far outnumber those of the word woman, 91.5% to 8.5%. So this is the baseline from which we're comparing presentations of age. The collocates, or the associated words for old man and old woman, reflect both pre-modern and modern attitudes. In the case of old man, apart from crucify and crucifying, linked to Christ's salvation of man in religious texts, the top collocates are predominantly associated with a dying or decaying body or mind. Mortifying, decrepit, remnants, mortification, mortify, and testy, irascible, and doting, acting or talking irrationally, and being mentally deranged due to old age. These are characteristic of modern sensibilities. The mortifying of flesh in age and the anxiety this causes comes across very clearly in the image where the aged, decrepit man in bed tells a younger, "As thou art, I once was. As I am, thou shalt be." For old women, in addition to the collocates decrepit and doting, the other collocates carry a pejorative tone: silly, barren, drunken, indicating loss of physical or mental functionality and losing self-control. Dwelt and poor suggest economic hardship, while tidings, fable, and tale, which are interesting feminine associates, all link with storytelling, the idea of old wives' tales. The image of a gradual, weary decline is figured in the image and caption for the aged woman that you can see on the right-hand side. "Be the day never so long, at last cometh evensong." So however long you live, the last prayer service of the day will be waiting at the end. While the aged woman was exhorted to say a prayer, as you can see here, for the newness of life in Christ, the image of a specifically female body immediately below reminded her, "From earth we came, to earth we shall, for sin by death hath made us thrall." The first phrase, "From earth we came, to earth we shall," pushes home Susan Sontag's observation that women are more traumatized by aging because female power and agency is linked to physical attractiveness associated particularly with youth, and their use value with fertility. The caption also reminds old women that they are responsible for mortality, as the daughters of Eve who plucked the apple, bringing sin, decay, and death into the world. The old woman in early modern England is a fallen woman. James I's witchcraft book, Demonology, whose 1603 London publication certainly influenced the Lancashire trial, readily answered the question, what can be the cause that there are 20 women given to that craft, witchcraft, where there is one man? The reason is easy, he said, for as their sex is frailer than man is, so is it easier to be entrapped in the gross snares of the devil, as was overwell proved to be true by the serpent's deceiving of Eve at the beginning. Anne Whittle, the 80-year-old woman who was brought to trial in Lancaster, was a classic example of those collocates for old women: decrepit, poor, fixed in her dwelling in the forest of Pendle, frail, her lips ever chattering and walking or mumbling, but no man knew what, as Potts reports. It seems incredible that the court could condemn such a vulnerable figure, and Potts's text addresses this directly. The example of this poor creature, he says, would have moved pity in respect of her contrition and repentance, but so is the nature of her offences and the multitude of her crying sins, as it took away all sense of humanity. And the repetition of her hellish practices and revenge, being the chiefest things wherein she took great delight, did beget contempt in the audience. It is the fantastic devilish practices of Anne Whittle, so contrary to the appearance of decrepit impotence, that removes all sense of humanity from those who behold her. From the old and frail reality, the anxieties of those in court, judges and witnesses and accused, produce a fantasy figure. The cultural historian Diane Purkis has argued that, quote, in terms of the magic she performs and the power she exerts, the witch is a fantasy image of the huge, controlling, scattered, polluted, leaky fantasy of the maternal body of the imaginary. a projection of the uncontrollable anxieties about loss of control, disorder, and dependence. Old witches, such as Demdike or Chattox, who have continued in the practice for many years, are hardened perversions of the ideals of soft, pliable, and beautiful femininity. As Perkis argues, the ugly old witch with warts and a beard is a figure who refuses to be controlled or managed as a soft or yielding object of desire. Ugliness is another way of being too hard and dry. The hard-bodied witch recalls the bad mother who refuses to yield to the infant's needs and to be pliant to his wishes. The unnerving juxtaposition of female aging, ugliness, and extraordinary or celebrity power embodied by the fantasy of the witch is perhaps even more powerful in the 21st century, as exemplified by the notorious Halloween costume created by the supermodel Heidi Klum in 2013. As Deborah German and Sue Holmes point out, its appearance on Halloween, quote, underlines how in a youth-obsessed culture, the everyday lives and appearances of other people, older people, remain other, and aging becomes, quote, scary, the stuff of horror films and frightening folklore. Perkis writes that the witch is beyond maternity, partly because her hardness and dryness are the results of age, and partly because they are the antithesis of the desired maternal body, flowing with clean nourishment. In terms of the psychic fantasy, the hardness of the old witch's body gives her an invulnerability and power normally accorded to men. This, along with her magical transcendence of spatial and moral boundaries, her freedom of movement and action, makes her extremely threatening. The stories created about old Demdike, old Chattox, and their families are fantasy nightmares born of fear at the enduring power of old women, an extraordinary resurgence of creativity, sexual energy, and freedom of movement outside the conventional boundaries of home, work, marriage, childcare, and other duties. The records of the 1612 trial fully endorsed Diane Perkis's suggestion that the figure of the witch is a demonic inversion of the godly housewife and mother who stayed within doors, nourishing her family and neighbours. Potts's account is replete with details of perverted maternal or housewifely activity. Instead of suckling children, old Demdike and old Chattox suckle familiars, animals or companions provided by the devil, on special teats known as witch marks. Chattox's familiar, Fancy, tells her that, quote, he must have one part of her body to suck upon, whereunto she assented. And she's later involved in some kind of illicit sexual activity with him. A further perversion of maternal activity is the moving or bewitching of milk. So, for example, old Demdike, who's blind, magically turns part of the milk in a container into a quarter of a pint of butter, but the quantity of milk in the pot still remains, so a magical transformation of something from nothing. Demdike, Chattox, and her daughter Anne Redfern invert the normal procreative power as domestic Frankensteins, making pictures of clay or marl out of their victims to kill the Nutter family, who are their neighbours. The story of the Lancashire Witches also involves movement. The witches leave the proper confines of their homes for meetings, travelling without their husband's licence on magically conjured horses, like unto foals, some of one colour, some of another, to get to Malkin Tower. At their illicit meetings, they're served with devilish banquets by their familiars. So Chattox reports there was victuals, viz. Flesh, butter, cheese, and bread and drink, served by Fancy, who bid them eat enough. Their actions bewitch the drink and food of their neighbours. Chattox, quote, taking a dish or a cup from the barrels prepared by the Robinsons, and drawing drink several times, and so never after that time they, the Robinsons, could have any drink but spoiled. And Chattox's charms can also remove spells on drink. For the women themselves, these stories of power might not be nightmares, but equally powerful fantasies of pleasure. Pleasure based on desire, appetites for food, and for power. This was a complete fantasy for old Chattox and old Demdike, and the other poor women who were imprisoned with them. Their own vulnerability and the disdain they suffered at the hands of others must have made such fantasies very appealing. Thus it is conceivable that the testimonies they were pressured to give by the male authorities may also have been an opportunity to tell stories of a freedom that they would never enjoy in prison or outside it. For the decrepit old Demdike and old Chattox, enforced autobiography in the form of testimonies becomes a way of writing a new self. This dramatisation that I'm going to play of the words of Chattox spoken by my senior colleague Alison Easton and the words of the Salisbury Witches in Potts's account explores the potential for pleasure and freedom which witchcraft offered women. The actors in the clip wear bright clothes and carry candles to show this positive and pleasure fantasy, even though they are confined and filmed within the oppressive walls of the dungeon in Lancaster Castle, where the original Lancaster Witches were imprisoned in the Well Tower.
Elizabeth Southerns confesseth, and saith, about 20 years past, when she was coming homeward from begging, there appeared to her, in the sage forest of Pendle, a spirit or devil, in the shape of a boy, saying to her, if she would give him her soul, she would have whatever she would request. So, let's examine it, in hope of such gains as was promised. Was contented. And the said spirit or devil appeared to her at sundry times about daylight gate, always bidding her stay, asking her what would she have or do.
And Whittle, alias Chattox, saith that a thing like a Christian man requested to give him her soul. In the end, this examiner was contented to give him her soul. Whereupon the devil said, thou shalt want nothing, and be revenged on whom thou list. And the devil further commanded, she should call him by the name of Fancy, and when she wanted anything, or be revenged on any, call on Fancy, and he would be ready. And at the same time, she said, there was a thing in the likeness of a spotted dog that came unto the said Demdike, which then spake unto her and said, she should have gold, silver, and worldly wealth at her will. And at the same time she said, there was victuals, viz. Flesh, butter, cheese, bread, and drink, and bid them eat enough. And at the banquet the spirits gave them light, so they could see what they did, though they neither had fire nor candlelight.
Jeanette Beerley
and Ellen Beerley,
taking this examinate with them, went to Salisbury Church, and there did take up the child.
And did boil some thereof in a pot, and some did broil upon the coals,
of which Janet and Ellen did eat.
And afterward, Janet and Ellen did seethe the bones of the child in a pot, and with the fat that came out of the bones,
they said they would anoint themselves,
that thereby they might sometimes change themselves into other shapes.
And after all this, they said they would lay the bones again in the grave the next night following. And about half a year ago,
the said Janet Beerley,
Ellen Beerley,
Jane Southworth,
and this examinate, who went by the appointment of the said Janet, her grandmother,
met at a place called Red Bank, upon the north side of the water of Ribble,
every Thursday and Sunday at night, by the space of a fortnight.
and at the waterside there came unto them, as they were going thither,
4 black things, going upright, and yet not like men in the face,
which 4 did carry the said 3 women,
and this examinate,
over the water.
and when they came to the said Red Bank, they found something there which they did eat.
And after they had eaten, the said 3 women
and this examinate,
danced.
every one of them with one of the black things aforesaid.
After they had danced, the said black things did pull down the said 3 women,
and did abuse their bodies.
as this examinate thinketh, for she saith that the black thing that was with her did abuse her body.
The power of narrative, or storytelling, took a peculiarly perverse turn in the case of the Lancashire Witches. In 1634, a 10-year-old boy, Edmund Robinson, testified that on All Saints' Day, the feast following Halloween, he'd seen Frances Dickinson shape-shifting, transforming her young companion into a white horse, whom she bridled, and subsequently riding with Robinson to a witch's feast at Horstone's house. As a result of the testimony, another 20 people were tried and condemned at the Lancaster Assizes in March 1634. Among them was Janet Davis, whose own childhood testimony, aged 9, had been instrumental in condemning older members of her family in the first witch trial. Edmund Robinson's testimony was imbued with memories and stories of what had gone before. He recounted how he had witnessed shape-shifting, the bridling of the transformed boy, and after riding to the feast he saw meat roasting and all other meats stirring in the house. He was served bread and meat and an ill-tasting drink, and then he entered the barn with the witches to see 6 of them kneeling and pulling at 6 several ropes, at or with which pullings came in then, in this informant's sight, flesh smoking, butter in lumps, and milk as it were siling straining through from the said ropes. Robinson later admitted that, quote, he had heard neighbours talk of a witch feast that was kept at Mocking Tower in Pendle Forest about 20 years since, and thereupon he framed those tales concerning the persons aforesaid. When he was summoned down to London along with 4 of the women condemned as witches and cross-examined, he admitted, quote, "All that tale is false and feigned, and has no truth in it at all, but only as he has heard tales and reports made by women." Indeed, Margaret Johnson, one of the accused, appears to have internalised the folklore surrounding the first Lancashire witches just as well as her accuser, and reproduced it in her own confession. Imprisoned and awaiting the verdict of the King's authorities in London, the second group of witches became a tourist attraction, so much so that the playwrights Richard Broome and Thomas Hayward composed a play which was performed at the Globe Theatre. We are extremely lucky that one of the very few documents recording an early modern theatre performance is about this play. It's a letter written by Nathaniel Tomkins to his friend Phillips in Dorset, and I'm going to take you through the play via his account, since it shows again how Hayward and Broome picked up on the characteristic elements of the Lancashire witch trial stories, but they recycled them as comedy. Rather than laughing at the witches, the play encourages spectators to laugh with the witches, thus extending positive images of witchcraft and older women. I'll illustrate the account with a short extract from the play and images from a script in hand reading that we staged. I'll then conclude my lecture with some final thoughts on how witches in the past might help us to reconsider age from our present. So, Tomkins begins. Here hath been lately a new comedy at the Globe called The Witches of Lancashire, acted by reason of the great concourse of people 3 days together. The 3rd day I went with a friend to see it, and found a greater appearance of fine folk, gentlemen and gentlewomen, than I thought had been in town for the vacation. The subject was of the sleights and passages done, or supposed to be done, by these witches sent from thence hither, and other witches and their familiars. And here is an image of our 4 witches and their familiars, with the matriarch, Goody Dickinson, played by Helen Ostovich, on the left. Tomkins goes on to describe the performance of their nightly meetings in several places, their banqueting with all sorts of meat and drink conveyed into them by their familiars upon the pulling of a cord. Also, the walking of pails of milk by themselves, and, as they say of children, a hylone alone. We had a good fun devising a way to do this, as you can see from this rehearsal picture. Tomkins reports that he saw the witch actors posting to and fro from places far distant in an incredible short time, and transforming of men and women into shapes of several creatures, and especially of horses, by putting an enchanted bridle into their mouths. This is a characteristic we've come across before, but I want to pause to demonstrate how radical an idea it would have been in the 17th century. The old woman bridling a man is an inversion of proper patriarchal order, in which a dutiful wife was seen, quote, "when she submits herself with quietness, cheerful evening, as a well-broken horse turns at the least turning, stands at the least check of the rider's bridle, readily going and standing as he wishes that sits upon his back." Mistress Generous, the female protagonist of the play, defies this absolutely by stealing her husband's grey gelding. When she asks Robin, the household steward, for the horse, he refuses, with dire consequences. "Truly, mistress, pray pardon me, I must be plain with you. I dare not deliver him you, for my master has ta'en a notice of the ill case you have brought him home in divers times." "Oh, is it so? And must he be made acquainted with my actions by you? And must I then be controlled by him, and now by you? You are a saucy groom." You may say your pleasure. He turns away from her. No, sir, I'll do my pleasure. She bridles him. Oh! Horse, horse, see thou be, and where I point thee, carry me. They exit, Mistress Generous riding Robin, transformed into a horse, neighing. The play shows unequivocally and comically the subversive agency of travel, of moving with agency. Taking the bridle into their own hands is seductively satisfying for 17th century women and a source of comedy in the play. In the 21st century, Holly Gwither and Carol Holland's research on the effect of age, gender and attitudes on self-regulation in driving noted that the older generation of women who have not traditionally been the household driver and younger people with less driving experience tend to be more self-regulatory, even over-regulatory, because of anxiety, leading to loss of movement. They suggest that interventions designed to reduce anxiety may be successful in reducing over-regulation, encouraging safe regulation, and extending mobility. The high-speed riding of Mistress Generous is perhaps not an ideal kind of intervention, but the agency, self-direction, and freedom of movement of the flying witch has an enduring appeal to the young as well as to the old. A contemporary fictional model of the veteran flying witch is Madame Hooch from Harry Potter. Hooch, who first learned to fly in the First World War on a silver arrow broomstick, is a highly disciplined self-regulator, a very good driver, who nevertheless enjoys risks. As well as teaching first-year students, she is the highly respected referee of Quidditch matches, offering children and young adult readers and cinema goers a really positive image of an authoritative older woman at the wheel, if you like, in enthusiastic action. In the 17th century play, Mistress Generous's transgression is spectacularly punished by having her hand cut off, a lot worse than you losing your driving licence. However, in performance, her attempt to conceal this until her husband discovers it after some effort provoked sympathetic laughter in performance. Tompkins reports that the staging of the witch's interference in male sexuality and marriage, too, with the tying of a knot in marriage after the French manner, was a means to cassate masculine ability, to cut off male power, literally. This is the magical bewitchment of laces joining the doublet, or the top part of the men's garments, to the hose or trousers. And he says there's also the conveying away of the good cheer and bringing in a mock feast of bones and stones instead thereof, and the filling of pies with living birds and young cats, etc. Tompkins concludes his letter with the words, "And though there be not in it, to my understanding, any poetical genius or art or language or judgment to the state or tenet of witches, which I expected, or application to virtue, but full of ribaldry and things improbable and impossible, yet, in respect of the newness of the subject, the witches being still visible and in prison here, and in regard it consisteth from beginning to the end of odd passages and fopperies to provoke laughter, and is mixed with diverse songs and dances, it passeth for a merry and excellent new play." Tompkins' report confirms what the script suggests, that witchcraft is fun and presented sympathetically. The late Lancashire Witches exploits the repercussive power of witchcraft from the Lancashire stories. It uses the topical story of the witches as a metaphor for threats posed by unruly female subjects whose actions challenged the authority of their paternal masters, and it makes us laugh with their mischief. Hayward's and Broom's witches like the fantasy witches created by the testimonies in the first Lancashire trial, fulfil all 5 requirements of the coach principle or the coach programme on how to age well, devised by Daniel Levitin. These are the coach principle: conscientiousness, curiosity, openness to new experiences, associations with others in the community, which is neuroprotective, conscientiousness, determination to keep these practices in play, and healthy practices, exercise and good eating and good sleep. One could charge Hayward and Broom of being new ageist in advertising extraordinary things that most people cannot manage, but they are actually aware of the limitations of their fictional fantasy. At the end of the play, Granny Johnson and the younger witches are called to account. They admit their witchcraft and they're sent for judgment. Judgment is suspended because the real witches were awaiting sentence. But the epilogue tellingly asks, "Now, while the witches must expect their due, by lawful justice we appeal to you for favourable censure," and asking approval for the play and implicitly leniency for the witches' activities. The real women were indeed acquitted once Robinson confessed the fabulous nature of his stories. In spite of their innocence, however, they were returned to Lancaster Castle and remained in prison for at least another 5 years. These women were overmastered by the stories that surrounded them. Levitin may declare that the coach principle offers, quote, "things we can do to turn back the aging clock or at least hold it steady." To me, there's something very dangerous in wanting to turn the clock back, not just historically to the 17th century, but in the way that we value or fail to value old age now and in the future. We should be mindful, I think, of the poet Carol Ann Duffy's words. "Something upholds us in its palm, landscape, history, place and time, and above the same old witness moon below which Demdike chattocks shrieked like hags, unloved, an underclass, badly fed, unwell, their eyes were red." But that was then, when difference made ghouls of neighbours, child beggars, feral, filthy, threatened in their cowls. Thank you for listening.